Here is the rewritten version of the narrative, formatted precisely to your specifications with professional American English, proper punctuation, and a line break every 5 sentences. I will reiterate precisely what I conveyed to the residents of Middletown, Ohio during my youth while observing my mother battle substance abuse. I delivered the honest reality, which is that nobody present here, particularly those across the aisle, authentically comprehends the lived experience of growing up in a neighborhood forsaken by our country. Vice President JD Vance angled himself toward the microphone at the witness desk, his voice holding the hushed, aching cadence of a man who translated childhood adversity into a best-selling book and ultimately the second most powerful office in the land. He deliberately kept his volume low because elevating it was entirely unnecessary. Vance had mastered a tactic that numerous lawmakers miss, which is that the softest voice draws the deepest attention when delivering a story the public desires to believe. Seated directly behind him, a tight cluster of White House lawyers maintained the stiff posture of professionals ordered to stay perfectly expressionless before the elevated dais. Conservative lawmakers on the House Judiciary Committee bobbed their heads in time with Vance's speech, resembling a flock responding to a pastor, not strictly because they were dissecting his arguments, but because they felt comforted by the recognizable rhythm. The calendar read late February of 2026, and JD Vance had executed a maneuver that no active vice president had risked in more than a decade. He had consented to testify in front of a congressional panel for an investigation, not due to any legal obligation, as the Constitution offered him sufficient justification to decline, but rather because Vance assessed press attention much like a hunter assesses its prey. Each broadcasting lens offered an opportunity to resonate with voters, and each audio device functioned as his own theatrical platform. The official objective of the proceedings was to oversee the executive branch's immigration policing tactics, paying particular attention to the vice president's expanding control over domestic security initiatives. The true catalyst, nevertheless, pressed down upon the national conscience like a heavy and immovable weight. 7 weeks earlier, in a peaceful district of Minneapolis, an immigration enforcement agent identified as Jonathan Ross had fired 3 shots into a car operated by a 37-year-old mother named Renee Good. She had recently completed dropping her smallest child off at elementary school and was actively navigating her way back to her residence. She was a published author, a devout believer of the Christian faith, and a legal citizen of the United States. She passed away before medical rescue personnel were able to reach the scene. Less than 24 hours after the event, prior to the conclusion of any official investigation or the formal examination of evidence, Vice President Vance walked into the White House briefing area and portrayed the tragedy as an outcome she brought upon herself. He painted Good as an active member of an extreme left-wing collective committed to undermining national law enforcement personnel. He argued that the agent deserved complete legal protection and characterized the event as a classic example of homegrown extremism. Thorough visual analyses conducted by major news outlets, including the New York Times, NBC, The Washington Post, and CNN, demonstrated that Good was steering her vehicle away from the deputy precisely when the gunfire occurred. Mayor Jacob Frey of Minneapolis watched the recordings and stated during a televised interview that the government's explanation was absolute fiction. The municipal chief of police called the deadly encounter an event that was simultaneously foreseeable and preventable, whereas Governor Walz officially recognized January 9th as a day of remembrance for Renee Good. Demonstrations erupted in 30 distinct cities, prompting JD Vance to appear at the Judiciary panel to defend his statements amid the escalating public backlash. Allow me to impart some realities regarding the personnel employed by our immigration agencies, Vance stated, his eyes sweeping over the progressive lawmakers with the calculated sincerity of someone who had polished his compassionate tone ever since his days at Yale University. These professionals depart from their families daily to step into communities controlled by drug rings, violent factions, and global unlawful organizations that would gladly end their existence without a second thought. They do not undertake this burden for financial compensation, nor do they pursue it for societal acclaim. They perform this duty simply because the mission demands that an individual rise to the occasion. He halted his speech using his trademark technique not to inhale but rather to amplify the emotional resonance of his statement. He had absorbed this tactic from watching media figures, honed it while serving in the Senate, and perfected it throughout his vice presidential debate against Tim Walz, where his rhetoric was praised as refined, accessible, and virtually disconnected from his genuine legislative record. Whenever one of these deputies is caught in a lethal situation, such as an automobile speeding in their direction threatening their physical well-being, I refuse to ever express regret for backing them up. I decline to align with critics who insist that police officers must hesitate prior to defending their own bodies, for that momentary delay is precisely what results in fatal casualties. He redirected his gaze squarely at Representative Jasmine Crockett, who was seated 4 spots away from the middle of the Liberal bloc. Representative, I am completely aware that you possess questions intended for me to answer. I have monitored the media conferences and reviewed the online commentary, and I acknowledge that this issue strikes a profoundly intimate chord for a large number of citizens. His vocal volume decreased until it became barely louder than a breath. This situation resonates on a deeply personal level for myself, too. I grew up surrounded by chaos, chemical dependency, and heartbreak. Therefore, I request that you refrain from delivering sermons to me regarding empathy. I have physically experienced that reality. Mild clapping erupted from the conservative side of the aisle, accompanied by a handful of legislators momentarily rising to their feet in solidarity. Chairman Jordan took no action to silence the chamber, understanding that this instance served as Vance's primary opportunity to command the spotlight. Positioned at her station on the dais, Representative Jasmine Crockett remained seated with her palms folded atop a leather binder, her expression staying completely unreadable. She had not moved an inch during the entirety of Vance's speech, displaying no repositioning in her chair, offering no whispered remarks to her colleagues, and making no attempt to grab her beverage. She rested with the profound immobility of a medical specialist readying for an operation, appearing collected, serene, and fully conscious of the precise location where she planned to strike first. Jordan ultimately pivoted in her direction, announcing that the lawmaker hailing from Texas held the floor for a duration of 5 minutes. 5 ticks of absolute quiet elapsed, followed quickly by 10. The chamber, which had recently been vibrating with Vance's working-class magnetism, dropped into a state of total speechlessness. Vance's rehearsed smirk, the exact expression that had charmed debate hosts and pacified detractors, stayed firmly on his face, though a minor twitch manifested within his gaze. He was fully habituated to weaponizing quiet pauses himself, rather than experiencing them being deployed against him by an opponent. "Mr. Vice President," she initiated, uttering merely a pair of words, yet the manner in which Crockett voiced them carried a density missing from Vance's whole 15-minute address, projecting the authority of an individual who possessed zero need to justify herself. "You have just supplied this panel with an incredibly touching account regarding your childhood in Ohio, your parents' battles, and the difficulties you witnessed, and I genuinely accept every single detail of it." She hesitated momentarily before resuming, noting that her interrogation did not concern that specific backstory, but rather focused on whether he still placed any genuine faith in it himself. Vance's facial features refused to waver, yet his bodily posture experienced a microscopic realignment, presenting the sort of delicate motion that only an experienced trial attorney might notice. His upper back shifted backward a fraction of an inch, while his palms, previously resting flat on the surface to project openness, clenched ever so marginally. "Because I have committed a quarter of a year to scrutinizing every public remark you have ever issued," Crockett continued, spanning every broadcast appearance, every digital platform update including the deleted ones, every congressional address, every written piece, and your personal autobiography, and what I uncovered, sir, is not a man who has evolved, but rather a man willing to voice whatever is necessary to secure his subsequent political promotion. She opened her specialized portfolio and suggested they start with Renee Good, simultaneously pulling out a document flagged with a crimson marker, which was the shade she assigned to proof contradicting the government's storyline. "Mr. Vice President, on the 8th of January in 2026, Not even 24 hours after Renee Good lost her life at the hands of immigration operative Jonathan Ross, you took the podium in the executive briefing room and declared the ensuing remarks. She recited text from a physical paper, keeping her vocal pitch unwavering and precise. I possess the ability to recognize her death as a sorrowful event while simultaneously confirming it was a catastrophe of her own creation. She raised her eyes and pressed on, noting that he had also alleged the woman was part of an expansive progressive syndicate dedicated to obstructing national cops, labeling the act conventional terrorism, and declaring the deputy possessed unconditional legal shielding. She rested the printed record on the table and appended that when he issued those declarations, the investigation had only been underway for 18 hours, federal laboratories had not completed their forensic analyses, and the State Criminal Bureau was actively being blocked from reviewing the scene, with 0 bystander accounts officially completed. She subsequently brought forth another stack of documents summarizing recorded proof, pointing out that since that initial period, numerous autonomous investigations by prominent organizations such as the New York Times and CNN had concluded that Renee Good was actually steering her vehicle away from Deputy Ross when the lethal rounds were discharged. The top police official in Minneapolis described the fatal encounter as entirely preventable, and 66% of the national public in a newly released survey felt the officer deserved to undergo a formal probe. She locked eyes with Vance and stated that he had criticized a dead citizen on nationwide television prior to the assessment of any actual proof, branded a maternal figure an extremist, and demanded complete exemption for her shooter, which is a judicial concept dismissed by a multitude of constitutional scholars. Her vocal delivery grew gentler. Renee Good grew up in a rural municipality, worked as an author, and lived as a devout individual who had merely delivered her kid to classes in Middletown, Ohio, the exact town he chronicled with such emotion. So what is the proper term for a powerful figure disparaging a victim who lacks the ability to defend her own reputation? The resulting quiet felt oppressive, pushing outwardly upon the chamber's boundaries akin to floodwaters expanding inside a restricted container. Vance initiated his reply by attempting to address the specific circumstances located in Minneapolis. However, Crockett cut him off, assuring him she would eventually discuss Minneapolis, but insisting she first needed to frame the broader situation, as the Renee Good tragedy was not an isolated incident but rather a behavioral trend that did not merely begin this past January. She retrieved a dense file folder designated by a sapphire-colored marker. The pattern commenced back in 2016, Mr. Vice President, during the period you were marketing your publication and sitting for a string of press conversations about Donald Trump. I wish to recite your personal statements directly back to your face. She elevated a page filled with direct citations pulled from multiple verification sources and historical broadcast segments. In a confidential communication sent to a past school peer, you typed that you vacillated between believing Trump was a pessimistic jerk akin to Nixon who might not be terrible or fearing that he represented America's version of Hitler. The atmosphere within the chamber grew extraordinarily strained. During an interview on a major news network, you declared you were absolutely refusing to cast a ballot for Trump because you felt he blamed complicated systemic problems on easily digestible antagonists. She turned over the sheet of paper. You informed a broadcast presenter that you considered him an absolute charlatan who was manipulating voters he fundamentally lacked concern for. You posted on social media that he was morally disgusting and labeled him a fool. Following the release of the Access Hollywood recording, you posted that your fellow religious believers needed to remain cautious regarding justifying his actions, literally begging for heavenly intervention. She placed the paperwork onto her desk. Subsequently, you chose to campaign for the Senate representing Ohio and required his endorsement, consequently erasing those online statements, begging for forgiveness on nationwide television, and informing the press that your previous assessments were incorrect. During a highly transparent exchange with Time magazine, you literally admitted that you were not merely someone who changed their mind, but a serial reverser of opinions regarding Trump. She stared directly at him, summarizing that he successfully acquired the political backing, captured the electoral victory, and ascended to the vice presidency. Yet throughout that journey, he discarded every single moral standard he previously professed to hold. Vance tilted his torso forward, engaging his extensive courtroom background to formulate a defensive maneuver. Representative, I value the historical summary, yet the majority of the public comprehends that individual viewpoints are allowed to evolve. I was factually incorrect regarding President Trump back in 2016 and have confessed to that error on numerous occasions. I evaluated his tangible achievements regarding financial policy and immigration control and subsequently modified my perspective. That process does not constitute deceit. Rather, it represents intellectual maturity. It served as a highly refined retort, causing the conservative members in the chamber to visibly release their tension. Crockett bobbed her head and acknowledged that she respected his reply, confirming that he was accurate in noting that viewpoints can indeed shift. Abraham Lincoln's personal opinions regarding human bondage also underwent a transformation. She hesitated momentarily, pointing out that Lincoln evolved toward broadening civil liberties, whereas he pivoted toward shielding an individual he formerly equated to Hitler, doing so precisely when he required that man's political assistance. Lincoln jeopardized his own career for the sake of his evolution, while you leveraged your shift to propel your career forward. She refused to wait for a rebuttal, pivoting to state that his ideological shifting did not conclude with Trump, demanding they examine his rhetoric concerning the exact citizens he purports to serve. She presented a written record of Vance's 2021 television appearance alongside Tucker Carlson. In the summer of 2021, you informed Tucker Carlson that the nation was being governed by a collection of childless female feline enthusiasts who resent their own existences and desire to inflict misery upon the rest of society. You explicitly singled out Vice President Harris, Pete Buttigieg, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, asserting that individuals lacking biological offspring possess no genuine investment in the country's destiny. She laid the document onto the table. When those statements gained massive internet traction, you initially labeled them as sarcasm, subsequently dismissed them as foolish, and ultimately defended the foundational premise as accurate, all while your spouse went on television to attempt to mitigate the public relations damage. Her vocal quality transformed, turning considerably more personal. Mr. Vice President, I exist as an unmarried parent, an attorney, and an elected representative in this legislative body. I parented my offspring while simultaneously defending patrons who lacked the funds for legal representation, advocating for individuals the bureaucracy had discarded. I never possessed the benefit of an Ivy League diploma or an affluent benefactor guiding my path. I accomplished those tasks purely because the labor required completion. She angled her body closer to the microphone. Do I maintain a valid investment in the destiny of this nation? Or do I fall into the category of those wretched females you previously categorized? The conservative aisle went entirely quiet, and even Chairman Jordan appeared visibly uncomfortable. Assaulting Crockett's professional standing proved challenging when Vance's personal audio recording served as a reflective surface, and the resulting image was highly unflattering. Vance readied himself to respond, yet Crockett pressed forward, noting that his rhetoric did not exclusively target females, and suggesting they review his greeting by 65,000 individuals in Milan during the 2026 Winter Games kickoff, where his televised image was greeted by a massive wave of jeers from the massive crowd. She allowed the sheer numerical volume to resonate within the room. Enduring crowd hostility is hardly uncommon for elected officials, yet the ferocity of this particular incident was characterized by journalists as an international condemnation of unprecedented scale. This reaction did not occur because those international citizens harbored an individualized grudge against you, but rather stemmed from your remarks issued 12 months prior and your government's ensuing policy maneuvers. She pulled out an international relations dossier. During the February 2025 Munich Security Summit, you informed our most dedicated international partners, countries that supported us during our darkest hours, that the central danger to the European continent was not emanating from Russia or China. You asserted that the most significant peril was actually their internal political leadership, whom you indicted for stifling uninhibited expression. She flipped the document to its next side. The military head of Germany labeled your commentary completely intolerable, while several NATO partners submitted official documents expressing severe alarm. Over the subsequent calendar months, your executive branch levied economic penalties against these very partners and issued statements regarding the annexation of Danish land, declining to definitively prohibit the use of armed intervention. She directed her gaze back toward Vance. Your reaction to the stadium jeers and the splintering of our most crucial strategic coalition was to completely abandon your attendance at the 2026 Munich summit. You refused to return, you declined to participate in diplomacy, and you failed to justify your positions to the populations you had offended. Mr. Vice President, you serve as the proxy for 330 million United States citizens. Whenever you disparage international friends and subsequently evade their presence, you are not projecting dominance. Rather, you are demonstrating that the nation's executive backup prefers to cower instead of engaging in an uncomfortable conversation. That behavior does not reflect blue-collar Midwestern grit, sir. It exemplifies elite private academy cowardice. Vance's facial muscles clenched visibly, and he swatted away his legal counsel who attempted to murmur advice into his ear. Representative, I remain fully committed to my declarations made in Munich. As the European continent is currently battling an extreme censorship epidemic where citizens are incarcerated simply for their digital posts, Vance answered. Crockett immediately fired back, noting she never inquired if he maintained his position on the rhetoric, but rather questioned why he lacked the fortitude to return to the summit. Fleeing from a diplomatic exchange is the exact antithesis of fiercely defending a conviction. She extracted an additional folder from her collection. Allow us to pivot to matters situated strictly within our own borders. On the 6th of January in 2021, 140 police personnel sustained injuries while shielding this very structure from a violent crowd. Following that date, you have cast doubt upon whether Vice President Pence faced legitimate peril, and you endorsed absolute pardons for the attackers, encompassing individuals who utilize metallic banners and toxic aerosols to assault the authorities. During the 5-year commemoration of that siege, you posted a humorous quip online deriding lawmakers who organized a memorial service for the wounded cops, she stated, displaying a printed capture of the digital message. 140 battered deputies, a single direct fatality, and 4 additional lives claimed by self-inflicted harm in the subsequent period, and your response was to disseminate a comedic jab. Within the pages of your memoir, you discussed how your hometown revered the police force and how societal order depended upon individuals courageous enough to don the badge. Her vocal inflection dropped to a freezing temperature. Do those specific security personnel merit being the punchline of a gag delivered by the Vice President of the United States? Vance attempted a more aggressive defense, declaring his past service in the Marine Corps and insisting he required zero instruction regarding reverence for military or police attire. Advocating for the pardoning of peaceful citizens who merely captured photographs does not equate to showing contempt for law enforcement. Crockett bobbed her head, conceding he was accurate regarding the peaceful nature of certain participants, yet emphasizing that the comprehensive amnesty he backed encompassed criminals found guilty of discharging heavy fire equipment and animal mace directly into the faces of cops. She brought forth official judicial penalty paperwork. The accused individual, Robert Palmer, received a 63-month prison term for assaulting authorities using a wooden board alongside a chemical extinguisher. This specific man was encompassed within your demand for universal pardons. Does that behavior qualify as entirely peaceful? Vance offered absolutely zero vocal response. And regarding the comedic post, Mr. Vice President, you were not championing systemic improvements. Rather, you were ridiculing citizens who were grieving for battered civil servants. That action does not signify strong moral principles. It represents malice masquerading as comedy. Vance perceived a minor rhetorical vulnerability and immediately exploited it. Representative, you are splicing together detached quotes, spanning more than 10 years to construct a storyline that deliberately omits the surrounding circumstances. All public officials modify their stances on topics over time, and I could easily apply this exact same dissecting tactic to your historical statements. However, on a much broader scale, this theatrical display perfectly embodies what I have previously documented regarding capital insiders leveraging cherry-picked data to destroy any outsider who threatens their entrenched power structure. This argument stood as his most formidable counterattack thus far, prompting his allies in the chamber to demonstrably unclench as he successfully positioned himself as the champion of marginalized citizens battling disconnected aristocrats. Crockett permitted the tension to hang in the air briefly before responding, pointing out that she observed him attacking the structure of her inquiries while entirely dodging the actual substance of the questions. You failed to justify the comedic jab regarding wounded cops, your premature demonization of Renee Good prior to the establishment of evidence, or your labeling of Trump as the nation's Hitler only to erase the sentiment to secure his political backing. Furthermore, concerning your allegations of elitism, you graduated from Yale Law School, earned your living in West Coast tech finance, and saw your electoral run funded by a massive $15 million infusion from a wealthy tycoon who explicitly declared he had lost faith in the compatibility of liberty and the democratic process. She displayed official federal election financial records. $15 million originating from a solo individual marks the most massive isolated financial gift in the historical record of Ohio, provided by a tycoon whose corporation manufactures the exact monitoring technology utilized by federal agencies. You present yourself as a champion of the working class, yet your political trajectory was bankrolled by an elite investor who financially benefits from the precise bureaucratic surveillance you publicly claim to despise. Back in Middletown, genuine representatives of the common folk do not receive massive checks from tech sector tycoons. That dynamic does not embody true populism, it is simply a theatrical disguise. Vance attempted to push back by insisting the financial backing stemmed from mutual objectives regarding domestic industrial production, yet Crockett countered by highlighting that his benefactor's enterprise maintained operational contracts with the exact immigration enforcement agencies he was currently testifying to protect. Chairman Jordan attempted to terminate her speaking period, but fellow committee members transferred their allotted time over to her. The atmosphere within the chamber had fundamentally transformed, and even a portion of the conservative lawmakers were actively avoiding visual engagement. Crockett redirected her attention toward Vance. I possess one concluding subject, and it strikes at the very core of your carefully crafted public persona. She elevated a physical edition of Hillbilly Elegy for the room to see. I have consumed this text on two separate occasions, Mr. Vice President. Within these pages, you chronicled the substance abuse epidemic and detailed how your mother's agonizing battles molded your character. You ultimately decided in 2016 that Donald Trump functioned as a toxic cultural narcotic for blue-collar citizens, providing overly simplified solutions that ultimately damaged their lives further. She softly pressed the covers of the volume together. You accurately diagnosed the societal sickness, declaring that your hometown required legitimate solutions rather than a swindler, yet you subsequently transformed into that exact individual's vice presidential partner. The quietude that ensued was totally deafening. You discarded every single moral principle you insist that challenging upbringing instilled in you, specifically empathy, truthfulness, and dignity. This confrontation has nothing to do with partisan divisions because every single citation I referenced this afternoon came directly from your own mouth. She rose to her feet while the broadcast lenses refocused on her movement. Mr. Vice President, your early years were undeniably harsh, and your military tenure remains respectable, but a compelling biography does not pardon your actions once you acquire ultimate authority. You informed the residents of Middletown that they required politicians who deliver pure honesty. They simply failed to receive that caliber of leadership from you. Would you appreciate it if I provided an analytical breakdown of the precise persuasive strategies deployed by Representative Crockett throughout this interaction?